The story of the 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 440 begins with a sense of rebellion, ambition, and pure automotive audacity that defined late 1960s Detroit. By this time, Dodge was no stranger to the muscle car wars raging across America, but was looking for a way to push deeper into uncharted territory, a way to combine the brute power of its full-size machines with the lightweight agility of its smaller models. The Dart, originally designed as an economy car for families and commuters, was in the first place anyone would expect to find the heart of a street racer. But within Dodge's engineering halls, there were men who lived and breathed racing, who looked at the Dart's compact A-body frame and saw not a grocery getter, but a weapon waiting to be unleashed. They understood that the secret to true speed wasn't just adding more horsepower. It was about power-to-weight ratio, traction, and balance. The idea of cramming a massive 440 cubic inch V8 into that small engine bay was almost unthinkable. It defied every conventional rule of automotive design, but that was precisely what made it irresistible to the gearheads who dreamed it up. At its core, the 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 440 was a statement piece for an era defined by horsepower bravado. The Dart had been evolving since its earlier, more modest incarnations, but 1968 marked a turning point. Dodge had already been experimenting with performance versions, such as the Dart GT and GTS. But when the engineers at Chrysler's Highland Park plant decided to take things further, they went far beyond what anyone expected. The GTS already came with strong engine options like the 340 and 383, both potent in their own right, but the 440 Magnum was a whole different animal. It was one of Chrysler's biggest and most powerful engines, and installing in a car as small as the Dart was a mechanical dare that bordered on insanity. Fitting that engine meant reworking the car's internals, mounts, and even the firewall. The clearances were so tight that you could barely slide a finger between the block and the surrounding metal. The idea wasn't to make it comfortable or refined. It was to make it fast, uncontrollably fast, faster than anything else its size had a right to be. The resulting car was both a marvel and a menace. The 440 cubic inch engine transformed the Dart from a lightweight compact into a fire-breathing street monster that could tear up quarter miles in terrifying fashion. Dodge had effectively created a Frankenstein's monster, an A-body car possessed by the soul of a big block brute. The mechanical packaging was so extreme that the car became almost impractical for everyday use. The lack of space meant power steering was impossible to fit, and even the simple act of changing spark plugs became a knuckle-busting ordeal. But to the enthusiasts and drag racers who ordered one, none of that mattered. They weren't buying comfort. They were buying dominance. The Dart GTS 440 could annihilate muscle cars costing thousands more, humiliate larger Chargers and Roadrunners at stoplights, and give even Corvettes something to fear. It was, in every sense, an outlaw machine. What makes the 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 440 so fascinating is that it wasn't really supposed to exist. It was a car born from loopholes, whispered conversations, and a shared desire among Dodge's engineers to prove that they could outdo everyone, even their own corporate overlords. This was a time when automakers occasionally bent the rules internally, allowing small batches of experimental cars to escape into the real world. The Dart GTS 440 was one of those creations. It wasn't designed for mass production or comfort. It was a raw, unfiltered experiment in pure speed. Dodge never planned to sell thousands of them. Instead, they built just enough to make a statement that echoed to the drag strips and muscle car circles for decades to come. These cars were often special order vehicles, assembled with care and precision, then handed over to enthusiasts who understood what they were getting. A machine that required skill, courage, and respect. On the surface, the 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 440 didn't look overly dramatic. It retained the Dart's clean, boxy lines, the simple chrome trim, and familiar Dodge badging. But beneath that understated exterior lurked an engine that redefined what performance meant for a compact car. When you lifted the hood, you were greeted by a sea of cast iron and chrome, a 440 Magnum V8 so large that it seemed to bulge against the engine bay. The car's modest proportions made the engine look even more imposing, and when it roared to life, the sound was primal, deep chest rattling, and full of menace. Even at idle, it had an unpredictable rhythm, like a caged beast ready to pounce. Driving it required both strength and nerve. The steering was heavy, The brakes demanded precision, and the throttle responded like a hair trigger. But for those who tamed it, the reward was a sense of control over something almost mythic, a machine that blurred the line between road car and race car. The creation of the Dart GTS 440 represented a defining moment in automotive history because it symbolized everything that made the muscle car era so extraordinary. It wasn't built for comfort, mass appeal, or marketing hype. It was built for few who craved power in its purest form, who saw the automobile not as transportation, but as an extension of freedom and rebellion. The late 1960s was a time when American automakers had both the freedom and the audacity to take wild risks, to build machines that were as dangerous as they were exhilarating. The 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 440 was one of the most extreme examples of that philosophy, a compact car that defied physics, practicality, and corporate caution to become a legend of raw power. It wasn't just another Dodge. It was a middle finger convention, a car that shouldn't have existed but did. And in doing so, secured its place among the rarest, wildest, and most unforgettable muscle cars ever made. At the very heart of the 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 440 lay the soul of a giant. The legendary 440 cubic inch Magnum V8 engine, an iron block masterpiece that came to symbolize raw, unrestrained American power. This wasn't an ordinary engine. The 440 was born from Chrysler's RB series of big block engines, known for their durability, torque, and ability to produce thunderous acceleration even in heavy cars. Originally, the 440 was designed to power Dodge's and Plymouth's larger performance icons like the Charger R/T, Coronet R/T, and GTX, machines with a weight and chassis to contain its ferocity. So when Dodge's engineers decided to shoehorn it into the much smaller, lighter A body Dart, it was an act of mechanical rebellion that bordered on the insane. The result was a car that no one had ever seen before, a compact vehicle with the heart of a heavyweight boxer. The 440 Magnum engine produced a factory-rated 375 horsepower at 4,600 revolutions per minute. But anyone who knew Chrysler's tuning practices at the time realized those numbers were conservative. In truth, most 440 Magnums pushed closer to 400 horsepower or more, with torque figures reaching a staggering 480 lb-ft at just 3,200 revolutions per minute. That kind of power in a car that barely weighed 3,300 pounds created a monster that could launch from 0 to 60 in under 6 seconds and tear to the quarter mile in the low 13s. Figures that rivaled or surpassed almost every other muscle car of its era. But the story of this engine goes beyond numbers. It's about how it felt, sounded, and behaved. Turning the key in a Dart GTS 440 was an experience of controlled violence. The big block roared to life with a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to shake the car's very structure. The camshaft's aggressive timing created a rough, uneven idle that sent vibrations through the steering column and seat, a constant reminder that this car wasn't built for gentle cruising. Pressing the throttle unleashed instant, overwhelming torque that slammed the driver back into the seat and made the rear tires scream for mercy. The acceleration wasn't linear. It was explosive, like lighting a fuse. The 440's dual-plane intake manifold and 4-barrel carburetor gulped down air and fuel in massive quantities, producing a surge of power that was difficult to control but impossible to resist. There was nothing refined or polite about the Dart's behavior. It was a street brawler, pure and simple. The noise was deafening, the heat under the hood intense, and the steering heavy due to the lack of power assistance. But these were all part of the car's visceral charm. Yet, the incredible performance of the 440 came at a cost. The engine barely fit inside the Dart's narrow A-body engine bay. Mechanics had to get creative just to make it work. Special motor mounts were fabricated. The exhaust manifolds were redesigned with tight clearances, and the engine bay was stripped of any luxury or convenience components that might get in the way. There was no room for power steering or air conditioning, and even the brake booster had to be modified to fit. Heat management was a constant problem. After a few minutes of idling, the engine bay turned into a furnace, and under heavy use, components could warp or crack. Changing spark plugs was an ordeal that required patience and scraped knuckles. The car wasn't designed for comfort or convenience. It was designed for one purpose: to be the quickest thing on the street. The 440 Dart was a car that demanded respect. It punished anyone who treated it casually. The massive torque could snap half shafts, tear through tires, or make the rear end lose traction at the slightest provocation. But for skilled drivers who knew how to handle it, the payoff was pure euphoria, a feeling of commanding a machine that seemed to bend the laws of physics. On the drag strip, the Dart GTS 440 was almost unbeatable. Its lightweight chassis, combined with the immense torque of the big block, made it a natural-born drag racer. Many owners removed unnecessary parts to lighten it even further, transforming their cars into quarter-mile demons. Tuned correctly, a 440 Dart could dip into the 12-second range, something that even some purpose-built muscle cars struggled to achieve. It was a car that thrived on competition, a car that didn't just win races. It intimidated rivals. Drivers of larger muscle cars like the GTO, Chevelle SS, or Mustang Cobra Jet often underestimated the Dart's unassuming looks, only to find themselves staring at its taillights moments after the green light. That combination of small car agility and massive power made it one of the most dangerous street machines ever produced by Detroit. And because Dodge only built a handful of them, each 440 Dart that made it into private hands became a piece of living legend, an outlaw among outlaws. Despite its mechanical brilliance, the Dart GTS 440 wasn't meant to be a mainstream car. It was too wild, too temperamental, and too extreme for the average buyer. Even Dodge knew that it wasn't practical to mass-produce a vehicle like this. It existed in a gray area between factory production and custom engineering, and that's part of what made it so special. The engineers who made it happen did so more out of passion than profit. They wanted to build something outrageous, something that proved Dodge could push the envelope further than anyone else. And the 440 Magnum engine gave them the perfect weapon. This power plant, already a legend in its own right, became something almost mythical when placed in the Dart's small frame. It was the kind of car that felt alive, that demanded to be driven hard, that rewarded bravery and punished hesitation. There were no safety nets, no computers, no traction control, just raw, mechanical power connected directly to the driver's instincts. The 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 440, powered by that mighty 440 Magnum, represented the pinnacle of muscle car audacity. It was an experiment that worked too well, a combination so extreme that it could only have existed in that fleeting window of time when automakers had the freedom to build cars purely for performance. Today, the 440 engine remains one of the most respected and sought-after big blocks in American history, but its pairing with a lightweight Dart body created something that will never be repeated. It was a machine that defied logic and reason, a car that existed solely because a few people believed in the beauty of excess. When you stood next to a 1968 Dart GTS 440, you could feel its presence even before it started, a tangible energy radiating from that massive engine bay, as if the car itself was daring you to unleash it. It wasn't just a car, it was a force of nature, and the world hasn't seen, and likely never will see, anything quite like it again. The tale of the 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 440 is inseparable from the spirit of rebellion that coursed through the veins of Dodge's engineers and factory insiders during the height of the muscle car era. This car wasn't the product of corporate committees, boardroom strategies, or marketing teams. It was born out of pure, undiluted passion, a project pushed forward by men who love racing, who wanted to prove that even the smallest car in Dodge's lineup could become a monster on the street and the drag strip. Officially, Dodge never sanctioned the idea of putting a 440 cubic inch engine into an A-body car. The concept was too radical, too impractical, and too difficult to produce in any large quantity. But inside Dodge's performance division, a handful of engineers and mechanics didn't care about practicality. They cared about domination. They knew that the lightweight Dart platform had untapped potential, and if it could be fitted with the same engine that powered Dodge's big bruisers like the Charger, R/T, and Coronet, R/T, it could obliterate everything in its path. So they quietly began working on what would become one of the most audacious factory specials of all time. It all started with the racing culture that surrounded Chrysler in the late 1960s. The company's involvement in NHRA Superstock and other drag racing programs had made its engineers experts at pushing limits. Chrysler had already seen success with factory-built race cars like the Hemi Darts and Barracudas, which were stripped-down, fire-breathing machines built solely for competition. But those were race-only cars, not street-legal production models. The GTS 440 was something different. It was a bridge between the showroom and the drag strip, a car that anyone could theoretically buy and drive off the lot, even though it was essentially a race car disguised as a compact. To make that happen, Dodge relied on internal rule bending and creative workarounds. The GTS 440 wasn't officially listed in every sales catalog or brochure, and it wasn't built in the same way as other mainstream Darts. It existed on the fringe of legitimacy, a car that technically came from the factory but in reality owed its existence to a network of performance-minded employees and dealerships willing to go the extra mile for their customers. The process of producing these cars was far from standard. Because the 440 engine was never intended for the Dart platform, the installation required significant modifications that couldn't easily be handled on the regular assembly line. Some cars were partially built at Dodge's Hamtramck plant and then sent to specialized facilities or dealers where the big block engines were installed. These weren't mass production vehicles. Each one required custom fitting, hand adjustments, and attention to detail. In many ways, every 1968 Dart GTS 440 was a one-off creation. Dodge never kept precise records of how many were built, but most historians agree that the total number was fewer than 50. That tiny production run has turned the 440 Dart into one of the rarest and most desirable factory-built muscle cars of the 1960s. Owning one today is like holding a piece of forbidden history, a relic of a time when corporate boundaries were meant to be broken if it meant going faster. Those who were lucky enough to order one of these cars often did, so through dealerships that were in on the secret. Dodge dealers who catered to performance customers, especially those near drag racing hotspots, knew how to pull strings to get their clients something special. Some dealers had direct relationships with Chrysler engineers who could arrange for a 440 engine to be installed in a Dart that was originally equipped for a 383. These cars were often ordered under specific option codes or through the special order system, which allowed for certain non-standard configurations. To the untrained eye, they might have looked like any other Dart GTS rolling off the line, but under the hood, they were something else entirely. When these cars started showing up at local drag strips, they caused a sensation. Racers couldn't believe what they were seeing. A small, lightweight compact car that could blow the doors off bigger, more expensive muscle cars. The Dart 440's reputation spread quickly through the racing community, and soon it became one of the most talked about cars of the year, despite Dodge never giving it the full marketing treatment. However, the creation of the Dart GTS 440 also highlighted a growing conflict within the automotive industry at the time. As the 1960s drew to a close, corporate structures within automakers like Chrysler were tightening. The freewheeling spirit that allowed engineers to build wild, experimental cars was beginning to fade, replaced by layers of bureaucracy and concern over regulations, safety, and cost. The 440 Dart represented one of the last gasps of that old-school mentality, a time when passionate individuals could make bold decisions and get away with it. By 1969 and 1970, that kind of factory rebellion became harder to sustain. Insurance companies began to crack down on high-performance cars. Government regulators were starting to take notice of emissions and safety issues, and public opinion was shifting toward more responsible driving. In that context, the Dart GTS 440 became more than just a car. It became a symbol of defiance, a last stand for the idea that cars should be built for excitement, not compliance. The scarcity of these cars added to their mystique. Because so few were made, each one developed its own unique history, often tied to the drag strips or local legends who raced them. Many of these cars live hard lives, tearing down quarter miles weekend after weekend, often modified beyond recognition or wrecked in the process. Those that survived became prized possessions among collectors and Mopar enthusiasts, revered for their rarity and authenticity. To this day, a genuine 1968 Dart GTS 440 is one of the most coveted Mopar finds, not just because of its performance, but because of what it represents, a time when the rules didn't matter as long as the car was fast. It embodies the spirit of rebellion that defined the golden age of muscle cars, when engineers acted more like hot rodders and the factory floor was just another extension of the drag strip. Looking back, the creation of the 1968 Dart GTS 440 feels almost mythical, like a story that shouldn't be real but somehow is. It was a car that existed because a few people dared to challenge the system, to ask what if, and then actually build it. It was the ultimate expression of Dodge's performance creed: unapologetic, aggressive, and fearless. And that is why, even decades later, the Dart GTS 440 remains one of the purest examples of what made the muscle car era so unforgettable. It wasn't built for marketing, profit, or mass appeal. It was built for pride, passion, and the pursuit of power at any cost. That rebellious DNA, that willingness to go against corporate orders and make something extraordinary, is exactly why the 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 440 will forever stand as one of the most legendary factory rebels in automotive history. By 1968, the American automotive world had reached a fever pitch unlike anything seen before or since. It was an era defined by horsepower, swagger, and fierce competition, when Detroit's Big Three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, were locked in a relentless arms race to outdo each other on the street, the track, and in the hearts of young American drivers. The cultural landscape was electric with rebellion and speed. Rock and roll thundered on radios. Drag strips were packed every weekend. And teenagers dreamed of nothing more than burning rubber in front of diners and stoplights. Every manufacturer was pushing limits, introducing faster, louder, and more outrageous machines each year. The year 1968 stood at the pinnacle of that movement, a golden moment when cars weren't yet constrained by emissions laws, fuel economy standards, or corporate caution. The Dodge Dart GTS 440 emerged from this perfect storm, a car so extreme and improbable that it could only have been born in that exact sliver of time when freedom, innovation, and recklessness ruled the automotive world. The late 1960s were a time when the muscle car wasn't just a vehicle. It was a cultural statement. America was changing rapidly. War protests, counterculture movements, and generational divides defined the era. But amidst that chaos, the muscle car became a symbol of individuality and defiance. It represented power and freedom, a rebellion against conformity. The Dodge brand understood this better than most. Under Chrysler's performance-oriented direction, Dodge carved out an identity that blended brute strength with attitude. Cars like the Charger R/T, Coronet Super B, and even the wild, drag race-oriented Hemi Darts became icons of performance excess. But the 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 440 was something altogether different. It wasn't about luxury, design flair, or mass appeal. It was about distilling the pure essence of speed into the smallest, most unassuming package possible. It was a car built during a moment when performance engineers were free to dream and act without restraint, when too much power wasn't seen as a problem, but a badge of honor. In 1968, every major automaker had a contender in the muscle car fight. Chevrolet had a Chevelle SS 396 and Camaro SS. Ford was making noise with the Mustang 428 Cobra Jet. Pontiac had the GTO, the judge of the muscle car world. And Plymouth, Dodge's sister brand, was preparing to unleash the Roadrunner. The competition was fierce, and bragging rights were everything. Dodge had already cemented its place with a 426 Hemi engine, a legend in its own right. But the company's engineers wanted something different, something more accessible and unpredictable. The idea of putting the massive 440 Magnum engine into the compact Dart wasn't about marketing or sales. It was about creating a street assassin. On paper, the combination didn't make sense. The Dart was a small A body car, lightweight and practical, while the 440 was a brute designed for larger, more stable platforms. But in the wild, anything that gave Dodge an edge in performance was worth trying. That was the spirit of 1968. There were no rules, just results. The Dart GTS 440's arrival turned heads because it upended the entire philosophy of what a muscle car could be. Up until then, the muscle car formula was simple. Take a mid-sized body, give it a big engine, and make it loud and fast. Dodge broke that rule by applying big block power to a compact frame. The result was a car that was both terrifying and thrilling. The 440 engine's brutal torque gave the Dart the ability to launch like a rocket, its lightweight body making it far quicker off the line than many of its heavier rivals. The car's small size also gave it a raw, nimble feel, though nimble was a relative term when so much power was pushing from the front. It wasn't a balanced car, it was a violent one. The front end was heavy, the rear light, and every punch of the throttle required skill to keep it straight. Yet, that unpredictability was part of its charm. In an era when drivers craved danger and control in equal measure, the Dart 440 delivered both in spades. Car magazines of the time were simultaneously awed and terrified by it. Test drivers described it as barely civilized, a car that felt like it wanted to leap out of your hands if you weren't careful. It wasn't refined or polished like a Mustang or Camaro. It was raw, visceral, and unapologetically brutal. In an age where many muscle cars were beginning to blend performance with comfort, the Dart 440 was refreshingly uncompromising. Dodge didn't build it for the masses. It built it for the hardcore few who understood what it meant to handle something that demanded respect. It didn't have the visual flash of the Charger or the broad appeal of a GTO. In fact, its design was understated, almost plain, but that anonymity was part of its menace. To the untrained eye, it looked like a regular Dart, a car your neighbor's dad might drive. Yet under the hood lurked an engine capable of embarrassing some of the most powerful cars on the road. That sleeper quality gave it an allure that still resonates with enthusiasts today. In many ways, the Dart GTS 440 perfectly encapsulated the American automotive psyche of 1968, daring, excessive, and fearless. This was a time when Detroit didn't build cars for committees or focus groups. It built cars to win races, sell dreams, and make statements. Engineers didn't worry about fuel economy or long-term reliability. They worried about horsepower, quarter-mile times, and the size of the carburetor. Every year, engines got bigger, compression ratios climbed higher, and speeds grew faster. The Dart GTS 440 fit right into that madness, a car that ignored practicality and chased performance with reckless abandon. It was an embodiment of that brief, golden period when automakers were unafraid to challenge physics, reason, and even their own limitations. But this perfect storm of innovation and recklessness couldn't last forever. Even as Dodge celebrated the success of its wildest creations, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. The late 1960s marked both the peak and the beginning of the end for unrestrained American performance. Insurance rates for high-horsepower cars were skyrocketing. The government was beginning to eye emissions regulations, and safety advocates were growing louder. Within just a few short years, the muscle car world that had given birth to the Dart GTS 440 would begin to crumble under the weight of these new realities. But in 1968, none of that mattered. In that one shining moment, Dodge's engineers had the freedom to do the unthinkable, and they did. They built a compact car that roared like a beast, a car that laughed in the face of conformity and left the competition spinning in clouds of tire smoke. The 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 440 didn't just exist in that era, it defined it. It captured the unfiltered essence of American automotive passion, when power was pure and limits were just suggestions. It was the last true expression of an industry unchained, and for that reason alone, it stands as one of the most perfect reflections of the muscle car's golden age. It was built not for everyone, but for those who understood what it meant to live on the edge of control, to feel the car's fury through the steering wheel, and to embrace the danger that came with unbridled speed. The world that produced such a car would never come again, but in 1968, for a brief, glorious moment, Dodge proved that anything was possible, and the Dart GTS 440 was a proof in roaring, tire-smoking metal. By the early 1970s, the world that had made the 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 440 possible was beginning to vanish, dissolving under the weight of a changing America, the golden age of unrestrained performance, when engineers could drop the biggest engine they could find into the smallest possible car, was coming to an abrupt and sobering end. The late 1960s had been a time of limitless ambition, where every automaker was locked in an escalating war for horsepower supremacy, but by the dawn of the new decade, that spirit had started to collapse under forces that no amount of torque could overcome. Government regulations, fuel crises, rising insurance premiums, and changing consumer attitudes began to reshape the very foundation of the American auto industry. The 1968 Dart GTS 440, that untamed symbol of freedom and mechanical rebellion, suddenly found itself belonging to a world that no longer existed. It wasn't that Dodge didn't want to build cars like it anymore. It was that the world wouldn't allow them to. The first blow came from an unexpected direction: insurance companies. After years of muscle cars dominating the roads and headlines with their staggering speed and rising accident rates, Insurers began to see them as high-risk liabilities. By 1970, premiums for performance models skyrocketed, especially for younger drivers, the very audience who had fueled the muscle car craze. Insurance companies started using horsepower ratings, engine sizes, and performance options to classify vehicles as high risk, effectively pricing many buyers out of the market. A car like the Dart GTS 440, with its massive 440 cubic inch big block engine, was almost impossible to insure without paying a small fortune. Buyers who might have once been eager to drive home a factory hot rod were suddenly faced with premiums that cost as much as their monthly car payments. The muscle car, once the symbol of attainable power for the working class, was rapidly becoming financially out of reach. At the same time, the U.S. government began to tighten its grip on the auto industry with new safety and emissions regulations. The Clean Air Act in 1970 marked the beginning of the end for high-compression, high-horsepower engines. Automakers were now required to reduce emissions, and the quickest way to do that was by lowering compression ratios and retuning engines to burn cleaner, but that also meant cutting power. The 440 Magnum, once a roaring powerhouse that made the Dart GTS a street legend, was neutered by new standards that demanded cleaner exhaust and quieter operation. By 1972, the once mighty 440 was being rated at far lower horsepower numbers, not only because of emission controls, but also due to a new net horsepower measurement system that reflected real-world output rather than raw potential. The result was a psychological blow to enthusiasts. The muscle car that had defined an era suddenly looked weaker on paper, and perception became reality. As if regulations and insurance weren't enough, the oil crisis of 1973 delivered the final strike. With gas prices soaring and fuel shortages spreading across the country, the era of high-octane performance seemed almost obscene. Drivers who once bragged about their quarter-mile times were now lining up at gas stations, counting gallons instead of horsepower. Automakers shifted their focus almost overnight, abandoning muscle cars in favor of compact, fuel-efficient models. Dodge, like its competitors, was forced to adapt. The Dart name lived on for a few years, but its identity changed completely. It became an economical commuter car, a far cry from the snarling beast it had once been. The Dart GTS 440 Spirit didn't fit this new world. There was no room for big block engines, no tolerance for 10 miles per gallon monsters that could roast their tires on command. The priorities of car buyers had shifted from speed and power to practicality and economy, and the market responded accordingly. The death of the Dart GTS 440 wasn't just the end of a specific model. It marked the end of an era of audacity. By 1971, Dodge phased out the 440 option for the Dart entirely, returning the model line to smaller engines that could comply with the new regulatory and economic realities. The wild, fearless experimentation of the late 60s gave way to caution, cost-cutting, and compromise. The engineers who once dreamed of pushing boundaries now found themselves constrained by emissions testing equipment and corporate accountants. The streets that once echoed with the roar of big block engines were growing quieter, replaced by the hum of smaller, more efficient cars. The muscle car era, once defined by noise, smoke, and swagger, faded into nostalgia almost overnight. For many, it felt like freedom itself was being legislated out of existence. The Dart GTS 440, a car that had embodied rebellion and raw performance, now seemed like an outlaw relic from a wilder time. And yet, even as it disappeared from showrooms, the legend of the Dart GTS 440 only grew stronger. Enthusiasts began to look back at the late 1960s with a kind of reverence, realizing that they had witnessed something unrepeatable. The cars of that era weren't just transportation. They were expressions of personality, power, and defiance. The Dart 440, in particular, held a special place in that mythology because it was so extreme, so unapologetically excessive, that it defied all logic. It had been built in small numbers, but its impact was enormous. As the years passed and performance cars became quieter, cleaner, and more computerized, the raw, mechanical purity of the Dart 440 seemed almost magical by comparison. It represented a kind of engineering honesty that modern cars, with their layers of electronic control, could never replicate. It was dangerous, loud, and inefficient, but it was also alive in a way that no car since has been. By the late 1970s, muscle cars were shadows of their former selves, and the once mighty 440 engine was relegated to trucks and large sedans. Dodge itself would not see another true performance revival until the 1980s and 90s, when nostalgia began to spark new interest in the glory days of horsepower. But even then, nothing quite matched the reckless daring of 1968. The Dart GTS 440 had been a product of its time, a time when risk was embraced, when engineers could make decisions based on passion instead of policy, and when speed was a way of life. The regulations that ended its run may have made cars cleaner, safer, and more efficient, but they also stripped away the unfiltered excitement that had defined an entire generation of American automotive culture. The end of the Dart GTS 440's era serves as a reminder of how fleeting greatness can be. It was a car that existed only because the stars aligned, because Dodge had the courage, the technology, and the cultural moment to make something so outrageous. Once that balance was gone, it could never be recreated. The 1970s forced automakers to grow up, to become more responsible and less emotional. But in doing so, they lost something irreplaceable. The Dart GTS 440 was the embodiment of that lost spirit, a machine built for a world where power was everything and compromise was unthinkable. Its disappearance signaled not just the end of model, but the closing of a chapter in American history, a chapter written in tires, smoke, gasoline, and thunder. Today, the 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 440 stands as a monument to an era that can never be recreated, a defiant echo from a time when cars were more than machines. They were manifestations of freedom, danger, and individuality. There will never be another like it, not because modern engineers lack the skill or technology, but because the world that allowed such a car to exist has vanished. Everything about the Dart GTS 440 was a product of its time. The cultural rebellion of the late 1960s, the fearless attitude of Detroit's engineers, and the open, unregulated wildness of the American road. Back then, speed wasn't just a number. It was a symbol of who you were and what you stood for. Building a car like the Dart 440 wasn't about pleasing committees or fitting within emission standards. It was about raw emotion and mechanical audacity. It was about creating something that scared you a little every time you pressed the pedal. That feeling, that reckless intimacy between man and machine has been all but erased from the modern automotive experience. In today's world, cars are governed by technology and regulation in ways that the muscle car pioneers of the 1960s could never have imagined. Every modern vehicle is designed to meet stringent safety and environmental standards, monitored by computers that optimize every spark and drop of fuel. Engines are muted by turbochargers and mufflers designed for efficiency and emissions control rather than character. Power delivery is smoothed out by traction control, electronic stability systems, and sensors that make sure drivers never lose control. In many ways, these are remarkable advancements. Cars today are safer, cleaner, and faster than ever, but they lack the raw, unpredictable soul that define machines like the Dart GTS 440. That car wasn't about refinement. It was about connection. When you gripped its heavy steering wheel, felt the vibration of that 440 cubic inch engine to floorboard, and fought to keep its rear tires from breaking loose, you were part of the experience. It demanded respect, attention, and courage. Modern cars isolate the driver. The Dart 440 demanded that you become one with it. The notion of taking a massive, high-compression big block engine and cramming it into a compact body would be unthinkable today, not just because of regulations, but because of liability, economics, and consumer expectations. Automakers now operate under global scrutiny. Their designs shaped by emissions targets, corporate image, and shareholder pressure. The Dart GTS 440 could never pass modern crash tests or fuel economy standards, and its exhaust output alone would violate dozens of environmental laws. Even its design philosophy, prioritizing power over comfort, speed over safety, and thrill over sensibility, runs contrary to everything modern automotive culture stands for. Today's buyers want technology, convenience, and sustainability. In 1968, drivers wanted noise, danger, and bragging rights. The 440 Dart wasn't meant to appeal to everyone. It was a car for the brave, the reckless, and the passionate few who valued power above all else. That kind of car no longer has a place in a world that fears risk. Another reason there will never be another 1968 Dart GTS 440 is the loss of creative freedom within the auto industry itself. Back then, engineers could take wild risks, often bending rules and working after hours to build something extraordinary. The Dart 440 wasn't approved by corporate marketing or product planners. It was a backdoor experiment, a product of enthusiasm rather than profit. Today, every car must pass through layers of analysis, focus groups, and financial modeling before it ever reaches the public. Passion projects like the Dart 440 simply can't survive in that environment. When Dodge engineers decided to stuff a 440 Magnum engine into the Dart, it wasn't because it was easy or practical. It was because it sounded insane, and that was reason enough to try. That kind of thinking has disappeared from mainstream car making. The Dart GTS 440 was built on instinct, not spreadsheets. It was fueled by adrenaline and pride, not analytics or market research. In that sense, it was as much an act of rebellion as it was an engineering accomplishment. Culturally, too, the world has changed beyond recognition. The America of the late 1960s was wild and untamed, a place where cars were symbols of identity, masculinity, and rebellion. The open road was a stage for self-expression, and horsepower was its language. The Dart GTS 440 embodied that spirit perfectly. It was loud, unrefined, and unapologetic. Driving it wasn't about convenience or efficiency. It was about making a statement. It told the world you weren't afraid of danger, that you craved speed, that you refused to conform. Today's automotive culture, though still passionate, is far more sanitized. Cars are leased, not loved. They're traded every few years for newer, smarter models. Few people today build personal connections with their vehicles the way drivers once did with machines like the Dart 440. That sense of permanence, of a car being part of your identity, has been replaced by a cycle of upgrades and obsolescence. The Dart 440 didn't care about upgrades. It was already the maximum expression of excess. The few remaining 1968 Dart GTS 440s that exist today are cherished not just for their rarity, but for what they represent. A final moment of unrestrained creativity and mechanical rebellion before the walls close in. Each surviving car is a time capsule, a living fossil from an age when performance had no leash. When one of these cars appears at a show or auction, people gather around it not simply because it's rare, but because it radiates a kind of energy that modern cars lack. The sight of that big block engine stuffed into that small body still feels dangerous, even standing still. It reminds us of a time when too much was never enough, when engineers built cars that were meant to terrify and thrill in equal measure. For enthusiasts, hearing the deep, uneven rumble of 440 Dart firing up is like hearing history come alive. A sound that carries the echoes of drag strips, late-night street races, and the roar of a nation obsessed with power. There will never be another car like the 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 440, because the combination of circumstances that created it will never come again. It wasn't just a product of Dodge's engineering department. It was a product of an era when passion could outweigh regulation, when danger was part of the appeal, and when automakers care more about dominance than compliance. Modern performance cars may be faster on paper, more efficient, and more technically advanced, but they lack the unfiltered essence that made the Dart 440 legendary. That car existed at a crossroads between genius and madness, with a line between innovation and insanity blurred. It wasn't perfect. In fact, it was flawed, temperamental, and brutal to drive, but those flaws are exactly what made it human. It was a machine that required heart, courage, and respect. It demanded something from its driver and gave back something profound in return: the feeling of absolute, unrestrained power. The 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 440 is more than a car. It is a myth, a mechanical outlaw, and a reminder of a time when men and machines shared a raw, dangerous intimacy that can't be replicated by software or sensors. It was forged in an age of boldness, lived fast, and left behind a legacy that time cannot erase. To drive one today is to feel the pulse of history under your fingertips, to command a piece of American defiance that refuses to be forgotten. There will never be another 1968 Dart GTS 440, because there will never again be a world wild enough, brave enough, or free enough to build it. It stands as the ultimate testament to an era when cars weren't built to follow rules. They were built to break them.